So good evening. It's good to see you all. So this is the fourth of this series, and this will be the conclusion of this part of the course. And then we're going to start it up again 3 weeks from tonight with the second part, just so you know kind of the flow. And we will continue our exploration of the divine feminine across the religions. And just a couple of preface tonight. I'm going to speak for a little bit about the origins of this gender imbalance in society, in our religious institutions, and a particular body of research that I have found particularly compelling, developed by a historian named Gerda Lerner. And then we'll have some meditation time on that, and then we'll have some small groups to explore what this has brought up and what this has stirred up. And then we'll come back into the plenary and have a time for really questions and responses and engagement around all of what's been coming up over the last 4 weeks. So I want to begin by explaining a little bit about my own journey in terms of exploring the history of this whole gender imbalance, if you will. I think I've mentioned before, so I'll be very brief, that I first encountered the engagement with the structural injustice around gender when I was an undergraduate student, and I had to take some social psychology classes to meet my requirement. And so I took one called Social Problems, and in that class, one of them was addressing the whole issue of gender imbalance. And I was fascinated because it was something I had not realized. And I thought I was a pretty aware person, pretty clued in. And this was something I was really unaware of. I lived with, my family. I had 3 sisters. And so I had plenty of opportunity to have discerned certain things, but I took for granted the whole structure of the family. And sure enough, in our family, the males were more valued. It was very clear that we were headed for careers, and the girls merely needed to make sure that they married properly. That was kind of, well, it was pretty clear, actually, pretty explicit in certain ways, that was their main goal to have a good life, was to make sure that they married the right person. And then that's all they needed to do, kind of thing. And then my brother and I, we had to become the right man. And so there was more pressure on us in that way. And we also had more freedom in certain ways than my sisters had. All of those fairly usual, ingrained social habits, norms, and beliefs were there. But I never questioned them. It never occurred to me to question them until this course. So that was the beginning of an awakening. And of course, at that time, I was also having my own challenges and explorations with relationships with women and with the feminine, and bumbling a lot. So all that put together, I began to realize that there was something really huge going on here. And it became a real interest of mine. And at that time, I read, the literature of the time, Simone Beauvoir and the other kind of classics of that time. And really, in a sense, I would say became, you could say, a feminist or a supporter of women's issues in my own way. But I also then, as I became a graduate student, got drawn into physics. I sort of went off in that direction and sort of left it for a while. But I just bring that by way of background, because then later in my professional life, when I encountered really sexual harassment and explicit exploitation taking place within my professional community, that's when I began this whole gender equity and reconciliation work, and then really began to try to understand more deeply how this all came about. And also then in my spiritual journey, experiencing having a whole series of meditations in relation to the feminine, in relation to feminine deities, visitations. So there was a whole awakening in terms of experiencing the feminine side of at least the archetypal dimension of God, if you will. I've spoken a little bit about that in this course, and will continue to bring in examples of my own experience, just as a way of illustrating what is my own relationship to this, and also my own ongoing mystery in relationship to it, because I have been and feel that I am devoted to the divine feminine in a very deep way. And part of this also comes from the fact that I was, my primary teacher was a woman, is a woman from India, who came into my life and worked with me very intensely for 3 years and then disappeared, preparing me for that, and basically said to me that unless she left, I wouldn't grow, because I would just follow her wherever she went. And as she put it, true masters create other masters, not followers. So your only chance of developing any mastery in your own right is if I leave. And so that was how it kind of came to a conclusion. And during those 3 years, she worked with me at a level that I have never experienced before or since. But it basically completely reworked my being from the inside out. And there was a lot of intensive purification that was needed, and also a kind of transmission. And when she left, she said to me that a fire has been branded, if you will, in your heart. And it is the flame of divine love. And now it's completely up to you whether that flame just dies out or becomes a roaring blaze. It's between you and God, and I'm out of the picture. My work with you is over, and you are released to your own destiny. And I really felt the truth of that, and I also felt the abandonment. I felt deeply abandoned and went through this whole process internally around that. Of course, all of that was my egoic attachment. And she used to say to me, you know, if you're true to this path, we will always be connected. But if this is merely an attachment to form, then I will fade away from your conscious awareness, and I will just become a distant memory. And of course, I struggled with that because I so appreciated and loved being in her presence. I didn't want to lose that physical presence. But she was emphasizing that the whole point was that this process had been passed on through her heart into my heart. It wasn't from her, it was through her. She was very clear about that. And she said that in the true spiritual gift, it can only ever be given by the divine directly. It's never, the guru or the teacher is simply an enabling instrument to help and support the student or the disciple to follow the path where the gift can be given to them, to help them do the preparatory work and the purification work so that whatever that gift is can be given to that student directly. And then she said that the challenge is that when the gift is given, because it comes from an invisible source, the student naturally attributes it to the teacher. There's a natural tendency to basically see the teacher as the source of the gift. And in that, the student is deceived and the teacher is tempted to take credit for something that can only come directly from the source. So that just gives you a little bit of my own background in terms of this particular initiation. And she was very connected to the deities of India, male and female, and very, very strong devotee of Ramakrishna and of Ramana Maharshi, and also of the Hindu female deities, Durga in particular. So there was this powerful presence that would come through her at times. And all I knew was that I was in the presence of something very remarkable and very profound, and that I was blessed beyond all measure. But I also knew I was way over my head. This was something larger than me, greater than me, and uncompromisingly profound and also demanding. And I felt at times that I was literally in the presence of the Divine Mother. And in fact, one of the images of Durga is of her riding on a tiger. And she comes riding on a tiger and she has this spear. With that spear, she pierces the heart of this warrior who encounters her, who's presuming to enter into battle with her in some way. But she pierces the heart. And in piercing the heart breaks. And this powerful warrior is reduced to ashes, if you will. And of course, that's the symbolism of the transformation of the heart. And that's what happened in my encounter with her. There was a piercing of the heart, a transmission from heart to heart. And then she left, and I was left, bereft, and went through this whole process of transmutation of my own pain, my own anguish, my own feelings of pity, self-pity, and being abandoned, and all of this. And then what happened was what she said would happen, is that the presence would grow in the absence. That coming through all of that, there would be this kind of profound release and relinquishment. And I remember feeling the supreme irony of the one thing that I wanted most in this world, which was just to be with her, was being denied me. And everything else paled in significance. So there was this sense of all of the other things, many of them were good things that were happening in my life, didn't hold a candle to this one thing that I so wanted and I so longed for, and that was being denied. And in that denial was a stripping away, a deep stripping away of so many layers of, and an unraveling of my psyche, and a kind of getting clear about the one thing I really did want. And she used to say to me before she left, she said, the pain is the medicine for the pain. Go into the pain and take it directly to the source and unburden yourself there. So there was a quality of taking this pain directly to the invisible infinite source. I had no choice. I couldn't do anything else with it. It's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to take it to her or maybe to someone else, but it was such a private, intimate connection that that I had no choice but to simply go inward and process it there. And this took quite some time, a few years, in fact. And then through that period, my whole sense of identity and also my entire life and every aspect of my life became transformed and reoriented in a completely new direction. I mean, it wasn't completely new in one sense. I had been an activist, I continued that, but I really shifted at that point. And I had also been doing this gender equity and reconciliation work for 5 years by that point, which is one reason why I think she was sent to me, if you will, because I do think it was a divine appointment. It was not something that I would have even recognized. I didn't recognize it because the way I met her was I was teaching a course and she was a student in it. So I thought I was the teacher and she was the student. So it took me a while to realize what I was dealing with. And so I feel that part of what happened was that there was a certain amount of work, purification, clearing out that had to be done in the depths of my being in order for me to actually fulfill the mission of the work that I was giving myself to. And if you will, God knew that. And so she was sent to work on me, and she did so. And so I feel that I speak about this because I feel that through her, I received both a direct experience of an aspect of initiation, if you will, into this path of divine love, and a direct connection to, in particular, the feminine divine. And she was very, very clear about the incredible damage of the patriarchy on the entire human civilization. And she spoke with incredibly powerful eloquence about it, and depth and personal experience. She had really lived it in a very gruesome way. So I was both profoundly blessed and also, in a sense, given a charge, which I'm more than still, I'm totally committed to, which is to do whatever I can to heal that division in the human psyche, in the human society, in the human civilizations. That division between the masculine and feminine, if we can call it that. It's a little simplistic, but it's basically that polarity, and to bring those into balance on every level within ourselves, in our culture, in our society, and in particular in our spirituality, because it's there where there has been such a ruinous oppression in certain ways, in the very institutions where one might have hoped for better, because all of the religions teach, love thy neighbor as thyself, and compassion and justice for all. And so there is the principle of equity is foundational. Equity, morality, and spiritual equality of all souls is clear in all of the traditions. And yet we find this horrendous imbalance across really all of the major world religions. So how did it get this way? This is really the question that I want to address tonight with one particular perspective. There are many different perspectives on this. And Friedrich Engels, for example, and Marx and Engels developed a whole theory that was associated with the rise of agriculture. And he was, according to later researchers, correct in his assessment around the correlation with the rise of agriculture, but mistaken in the timing. And his research was based on certain, ethnographies, and I don't know the details, but I know that they have later been regarded as proven to be inaccurate. So he did a good job in his way of identifying some of the early correlations in the rise of this, what is sometimes called patriarchy. Patriarchy is a bit of a challenged term nowadays because it's seen as blaming men, which is not really fair to men in certain ways, and it's a limiting term in certain ways. But it's also not totally an accurate term because men did afford to themselves certain powers, and that those structural imbalances were definitely organized along gender lines. So there are other theories also like sociobiology, looking at the biological difference, and essentialist theories. And so it gets very complex. And then there's debates back and forth, as you can well imagine, and intensive, acrimonious debates at times. All of that has its place. What I want to outline tonight and summarize for you is the research, some of the research that I found most compelling in this field. And it comes from a historian named Gerda Lerner. And Gerda Lerner was born, I should know the year, but roughly around 1930-ish. And she was born and raised in Vienna, Austria, where actually I also lived as a child. So I have a kind of direct connection to Austrian culture. And she grew up in Vienna. And then when she was 16, the Nazis were taking over, and she was Jewish. And so she had to leave like urgently. She and her family left Austria, escaped initially to Switzerland, and then made it to America. And so she came to America, and she eventually became a historian. And at first she was involved in filmmaking, and I forget the earlier part of her life, but then I think by her mid to late 30s, she became an academic and an historian. And what she found, to her amazement, was that there was no history of women, that women have no history. There wasn't a recorded history of women's experience, that most history is indeed, as the word itself says, his story. And what about her story? So she wasn't particularly feminist. She was sensitive to, obviously, to the feminist awakenings that were happening around that time in the 60s and 70s when she was developing her intellectual acumen. But she wasn't coming from that place. She was really wanting to understand what actually happened historically. How did things get the way they are? And so she began a cross-cultural research into the origins of gender imbalance. And what I'm going to do tonight is go through really what she came to. She wrote several books and articles. Probably the foundational text is called Creation of Patriarchy. That was her first book. Then she wrote another one called Rise of Feminist Consciousness, which is really women's attempts to try to correct the patriarchal imbalance. And then she wrote a very beautiful book and very relevant to our culture now called Black Women's Experience in America. So she was very drawn and deeply troubled by the structural injustice around race as well as gender. So she was an early one on the intersectionalities and the whole connections there. So I'm going to share some slides to go through this briefly with you. Let's see now, here we go, sharing slides. Coming here. Go back to here. See if we, now let's see what the slides show. There we go, okay. So what Gerda Lerner did, and the reason I find her research so compelling, is that she made a very careful study of many of the ancient societies as far back as she could go, but looking for actual historical records. So it wasn't just hearsay. Her research is based on legal codes and existing historical documents in different societies that go all the way back to 3100 BC in Mesopotamia. So 3100 BC, we're talking long before any of the Western religions had emerged. The oldest obviously being Judaism, and the Bible was written somewhere between 1000 and 300 to 400 BC. So this is way before that. And one of the things that she's very clear about, and her research, in my view, demonstrates very clearly, is that this imbalance was inherited by the religions. It was not created by the religions. They're often seen as the culprit, and sure enough, they have played a huge role in denying, in supporting structural injustice around gender. But here's the bottom line of what she found. And what she was surprised to find this, she was not going and looking for a spiritual component. She was more expecting a kind of sociological analysis, if you will. But what she found in common across these different societies, in many ways were independent of one another, she found a common factor in all of them. And that was this first, what she calls the first founding metaphor, and this common principle that patriarchy emerged in each of these societies when at some point women were excluded from the divine and devalued in relation to the divine. So in a sense, women's spirituality was desecrated. And that this, then later it became instituted in legal codes, norms, religious practices, and all of that. But when that happened in that society, then along with it came patriarchy. And the early manifestations of that were that women's sexuality and reproductive capacities then became commodities, bought and sold in a certain sense, and systematic control and oppression of women followed. So women and their sexuality and their reproductive capacities became commodities, traded in the marketplace through different means, through prostitution, through, dowries and various kinds of institutional norms, some of which were respectable, some of which were so-called unrespectable. So anyway, this is what she came to. And of course, I note here that men's spirituality was also betrayed and severed by mediation through the priesthood and the church. So men's connection to God, although it was, more direct, if you read the scriptures, for example, the covenant with God, men have the requisite equipment of the capacity to be circumcised, and the covenant with God that was established in the book of Genesis between Abram and God, basically, according to some of the analyses that she cites, and I find this very interesting, so since I'm interrupting myself, I'm going to stop share for a minute. She basically shows that it was discovered at one point that men are associated with childbearing. It had been believed that childbearing was simply a gift of the gods, and it was discovered in early humanity that men had something to do with it. And so suddenly, men's role in procreation gave men this unique status. And there was a whole focus then on the seminal line, whose son, the father line, and the sons of men became the focus. And so there was also, and she's pointing to other scholars, not only her own take on it. So she's citing other scholars, some of whom point to the fact that once this discovery was made, suddenly this magic seed was seen as the source of the creation of life. And so the member through which this magic male seed comes was then also somehow exalted and enshrined. And then this was related to the covenant with God. Now, I am not, I should have said at the beginning, I am not a historian, and I am not a, you know, deeply erudite scholar of these things. I've read her work and a few related works, and there's much depth, much more than I can go into tonight, and much more than I have ever gone into. There are many other sources to be read. So I am very briefly summarizing some of the key points that are in this body of scholarship and exploration. And there are different interpretations and all of that. So, I'm doing my best to wade through it to come to some kind of clarity about how all this came about. And my purpose tonight is to kind of impart that to you in about 20 minutes. So please recognize this is a vast compression, and then it's distilled through my own comprehension, which is limited, and my limited level of scholarship in this field compared to, certainly to others. Nevertheless, it's quite compelling, this material. And one of the things that is pointed out is that in the covenant with Abraham, when God makes the covenant with Abraham, he renames Abraham. Abraham was Abram. He renames Abram Abraham at the moment that he establishes circumcision as the sign of their covenant. And so the importance of this is that in that moment, women are cut out of the divine covenant because they don't have the requisite equipment. They can't be circumcised. They don't have the member that is circumcised. And so there's a whole question of what that meant for women, because in a certain sense, they are cut out of the covenant with God right there at the beginning. And she points to the fact that this seems to have its precedent earlier than the Bible. So the Bible was simply recording a kind of series of events that had already taken place. That the Bible is not the source of these things, but that the book of Genesis, which was written over like a 400-year period, was inheriting this from previous early civilizations. Mesopotamia, perhaps, I forget which ones. But in any case, there was a sort of passing into the origins of the Judeo-Christian tradition, this whole patriarchal connection with God. And so, but there was in that, and somewhere right in that time, there was the dethroning of the goddess. So we'll get to that in a moment. I also had a speculation, this is pure speculation, but when you think of something like the practice of female genital mutilation and how, what a violent act that is in some ways. And we have some friends who are activists in that arena from Africa, really working to try to raise awareness about it. And it just occurred to me, I wonder if that might possibly have emerged. This is my own personal musing, from women trying to get in on the covenant with God. In other words, if circumcision is the requirement, maybe somewhere way back in history, women also entered into a practice of some kind of circumcision so that perhaps they too could also be directly participating in the covenant. I don't know. It's a question. But one wonders how these things emerged in the first place. In any case, back to our slideshow here. So this is the summary. This is part of the summary. This is what she calls the first founding metaphor of Western civilization. She says there are two key founding metaphors. And she then explains how this happened. So she basically says long after women were sexually and economically subordinated to men, and she articulates that in great detail with lots of historical documentation. But still, they still played active and respected roles in mediating between humans and gods. So they were priestesses, seers, diviners, healers. So the metaphysical female power was still recognized and worshipped by both men and women in the form of powerful goddesses. So there's this that's a very important thing to recognize, that even after women were sexually and economically subordinated to men, there was still a worshiping and an honoring of the goddess. Very similar to what you see in India, where there is a very profound recognition of the feminine divine in the spirituality of India, and a true equality, kind of gender equality there, in terms of the consorts of Shiva and Parvati and Brahma and Lakshmi and all of the different deities. But then the reality on the ground is, that it's an oppressive, very oppressive, patriarchal society when it comes to women and men in society. So, but then what happened was there was this dethroning of the powerful goddesses and their replacement by a dominant god. And she says that this occurred in most Near Eastern societies after the establishment of a strong and imperialistic kingship. And then she goes on in the writing of the book of Genesis. These are quotes from her. So what I've done is I've taken certain quotes that capture the essence of the flow of her entire argument so that you can get a flavor of her thinking. In the writing of the book of Genesis, creativity and procreativity are ascribed to an all-powerful God whose epitaphs of Lord and King establish him as a male God, and female sexuality, other than for procreative purposes, becomes associated with sin and evil. So this is the sort of the separation and dethroning of the goddess. So she says the result of this is that the basic symbolism and actual contract between God and humanity assumes as a given, the subordinate position of women and their exclusion from the metaphysical covenant and earthly covenant community. Women's then only access to God and to the holy community is in their function as mothers. And this symbolic devaluing of women in relation to the divine becomes one of the founding metaphors of Western civilization, what she calls the first founding metaphor. The second key founding metaphor came from Aristotle and Plato in the philosophical tradition, and actually predates it, as she says later, that the philosophy arose, and so it inherited this patriarchal tradition from hundreds of years earlier, and so sought to essentially justify it. And Aristotle and Plato both believed that women were inferior to men, although Aristotle, basically was against education of girls for that reason, and Plato supported education of girls. But they both agreed that women were inherently inferior. And this idea is quite closely accurate, that they are incomplete and damaged human beings. And there's a number of quotes from Aristotle. The woman, as it were, is a mutilated male, is one of his quotes. Really quite remarkable when you think about these profound thinkers and highly wise beings making these incredibly, at least to us nowadays, distorted value judgments. But in any case, these two founding metaphors, then sealed the consequences, as she puts it, is with the creation of these two metaphorical constructs, which are built into the very foundations of the symbol systems of Western civilization, the subordination of women comes to be seen as natural and hence invisible. And this is what finally establishes patriarchy firmly as an actuality and an ideology. And then to kind of go into, that's kind of the process, and then to go back more or less to the beginning of how we got there. She makes this very powerful claim that the origins of slavery started with the enslavement of women, that the whole institution of slavery began with the enslavement of women of conquered groups. This is the important thing to understand. So enslaved women were readily available for rape and exploitation without retribution. Basically what happened is these tribes, these warring tribes, when one tribe would win, they would kill all the men of the other tribe, and then they would capture the women and children, and suddenly they had all these women and children, and so they were then fair game for all manner of rape and exploitation. And so she says the appropriation of women's sexual and productive capacities occurred prior to the formation of private property and class society. And that commodification lies at the foundation of private property. So she says elsewhere that the first private property were captured women and girls, and that men learned to institute dominance and hierarchy over other people by their earlier practice of dominance over women. Women initially of a conquered tribe, and then that spread to women of their own group. And again, these claims are all substantiated with certain historical developments when you read her work. She's not pulling them out of thin air. Of course, they're still interpretations, but they're rooted in a lot of factual, archaeological and historical evidence. And then she talks about how this sexual subordination took place. It was institutionalized in the earliest law codes and enforced by the full power of the state. And women cooperated in their own oppression, which was secured by various means. And here are the means, some of the means: by force or economic dependency on the male head of the family, or class privileges bestowed upon conforming dependent women of the upper classes. So if you were well behaved and you conformed and you were well appointed in terms of your marriage of the upper classes, then you were given certain privileges that other women didn't have. And that kept you in the game. And then finally, this devastating one, the artificial division of women into respectable and not respectable women. And this gets very interesting in terms of the creation of class. So when she speaks of how class emerged, her understanding is that, first of all, class for women refers to those men. Class for men are those who own, the higher classes are those who own the means of production, and they can dominate those who do not. And of course, this is still true today in many ways. And class for women was mediated through sexual ties to a man, which gives them access to resources and privileges. Actually, he gives them access to resources and privileges. And there's a lot of truth in that today as well. And then here's the key, and really one of the ruinous consequences of all this: the division of women into respectable and not respectable categories was institutionalized by laws pertaining to the veiling of women. And nowadays we hear about the veils and the veiling of women, and we look at some of the veiling practices, in Islam and other cultures with disdain or horror. But all of this predates all of Western religion. The veiling of women goes way back. And here's kind of where it comes from. Women who sexually serve one man and are under his protection are designated domestic women, and they are deemed respectable. And they must be veiled. Respectable women must be veiled. Women not under one man's protection and sexual control are designated public women, and they are deemed not respectable. They must be unveiled. And so what you have are these veiling laws that emerge. Now, again, we're talking, 3,000 BC. This is not, something that emerged with any of the religions. It predates all of the major religions. And these veiling laws serve to distinguish ladies and other respectable women from the non-respectable women, which included slaves and prostitutes. And religious women were, of course, in a sort of separate category. And veiling was ultimately based on women's sexuality. In the case of religious women, presumably they were celibate, so they were sort of out of that whole game. And here's the key: there were severe penalties for non-respectable women who were caught wearing a veil. And these are encoded into law, some of these punishments of whipping with staves and parading them naked in the streets and, cutting off ears and pitch poured on their heads and things like this are recorded in some of these early laws as the penalties. So classifying women in this way became an affair of the state. It's a very key development. So you begin to see how this became encoded in human societies for thousands of years prior even to the emergence of religions. So it's natural with that heritage that at some point that would spread to the divine plane itself, that the goddess herself would be in some way dethroned. And so this is what then happened a little later, was these powerful goddesses were in fact dethroned and replaced by a dominant male god in most Near Eastern societies. Sexuality and procreation were split in the emergence of separate goddesses for each function. And so then you have this split of the feminine divine. The mother goddess is transformed into the wife or consort of the chief male god and deemed respectable. And then female sexuality for purposes other than procreation becomes associated with sin and evil. Again, we're doing a very brief overview summary of what the whole point that she's making in her scholarship. And then we come to this exclusion then of women from religious leadership, where the contract between God and humanity assumes the subordinate position of women and their exclusion from the metaphysical covenant and earthly covenant community, so that women's only access to God and the holy community is through their function as mothers. Actually, one of our close colleagues, Swami Ambikananda, who founded the Traditional Yoga Association, really talks about this in terms of in India, women are revered as mothers, and spiritual leaders are almost always called mothers, Mother Teresa and Mother this and Mother that. And she's very respectful of that, but she says it also is limiting. Women are more than mothers, but mothers are really the only acceptable form of adoration and veneration for spiritual leaders in India. And a woman who's not regarded in a sense as a spiritual mother is not a legitimate spiritual leader in a certain sense. So anyway, then this summary again, these make these two founding metaphors of Western civilization, the devaluing of women in relation to the divine and excluding them from the covenant, and then the notion of women as inherently inferior. And these two combine to create this patriarchy as an invisible actuality and ideology. It's so strong that you can't even see it. And clearly the corollary to that then is to transform this. One aspect is that women must reclaim and reestablish their direct connection to the sacred and divine and reclaim their spiritual covenant with God. And of course, men must also reclaim their authentic identity and spirituality, which has been denied them. They too have been oppressed, and they must reclaim their integrity and cease to participate and perpetuate this kind of structural injustice. And interestingly enough, in that last point, that women must come to a point of reclaiming their connection with the covenant, we have across the traditions these stories of women who are so connected to the divine that they either work miracles or that they overcome the barriers of patriarchy. And there are many different stories, like the story of Draupadi in the Mahabharata, that great Sanskrit epic of India, the Mahabharata, which is where the Bhagavad Gita is found as a part of that. And prior to the Gita, that Draupadi, who is the princess, is lost in a dice game, and then she is brought in, and as their reward, they try to strip her because they've now reduced her to a property. They own her as a slave. So she's gone from princess to slave, and therefore they can have a good look at what they've just won as property because she doesn't even own the clothes she's wearing. So they can take them off of her. And as they try to do that and strip her, and this is, of course, in the royal court with all of the senior political and religious leaders of the kingdom, all in witness, none of them lifting a finger to intervene with these offending, marauders, which is a key practice, key part of the enabling of patriarchal structures, is that when the injustices happen and then appeal is made for retribution and justice, often it falls on deaf ears at the highest institutions, whether those are, political or religious institutions. And so those forces, those powers that be, are silently complicit And we see this today in so many ways. All of these institutions that were participating in these non-disclosure agreements that we've seen over the last few years coming out in relation to the Me Too movement that enable this exploitation to go on in different ways. And of course, within the churches, all the exploitation around sexuality and the way that it's been hidden. So it's still, this kind of dysfunction is still alive today, as we know. But what you see across the traditions are these stories like Draupadi. So when she is basically are trying to strip her and she's being betrayed by all the authorities of the land, and then she appeals directly to God in the form of Krishna, and Krishna works a miracle and saves her. Or in the case of Saint Tekla that Cynthia was speaking to last week, when she encountered, these threats to her life, and again they were injustice, they were completely, outrageous, and she appealed directly to Jesus. And there is an awe, even within the institutions of religion, of women who are connected to God in this way, because they are then having their own direct, unmediated intervention, if you will, from the divine plane working through them. And they have no need of priests or institutions because they are directly connected. And I want to say that I find it very interesting across the traditions that there are the stories of these different women. There's, Yajnavalkya in the Upanishads, and Rabi'a in Sufism, and Draupadi, and Sita, and others in Hinduism. And then in Christianity, certainly Tekla, and also Mary Magdalene. There's that beautiful Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Mary, in which Jesus says to her, he gives her really the same teaching that Krishna gives at the very end of the Bhagavad Gita, when he says to her, seek the Son of Man in your own being, inside yourself. In other words, go within to find Christ. And then he says, for those who seek him there will find him, and put up no other laws, lest you too be required to obey them. So it's a very interesting thing. He's saying, seek God, seek Christ in the depths of your own being. And that is the final and full practice, and put up no other laws, no other requirements, no other practices really. Krishna says something very similar at the end of the Gita when he says, abandon all the dharmas and take absolute refuge in me, in the depths of your own being. Find me in the depths of your own being, and we will be united as one. And I think that is so significant that Jesus in the Gospel of Mary is telling her this. And that gospel, of course, as we know, was removed from the canon, God forbid, because that teaching really says we have no need of priests. We have no need of mediators. Seek the direct connection in the depths of your own being and put up no other laws. And then you shall live the divine life, and you shall find that Christ, that Krishna within yourself. And you need nothing else. That is incredibly threatening, both to the patriarchy and to the religious power structures. And that is also, in a certain sense, the ultimate, in a certain sense, the spiritual pathway for every human soul, is to find our own direct connection to God and to live that. So I think I'm going to bring this to closure now. I've been talking for quite a while. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. And I think we're going to move into some silent time, and then into some small groups, and then some plenary time together. Thank you. Cynthia, do you want to lead us in this meditation a bit?
Sure. So, hello, everyone. So, why don't we just gently close our eyes and or have a soft gaze away from the devices. And as you move into the silence, just to be with all that's been offered, see what is stirring in you, what is arising in you. And just be in the silence of the heart. Keep your focus coming back there, even as thoughts of what has been presented by Will come up. Just come back into the heart, centering in the silence. And we'll ring the bell in probably about, what do you think, Will, 10 minutes?
Yeah, that sounds right. Mm-hmm.
I'll have a 10-minute silent sit. Now, keeping your eyes closed, I'd like to just offer up a prayer. O Holy One, my heart is sad by all the ways that we have been kept from you, denied access to you over the history of humanity. And at this time, I just feel like saying a prayer for all the people who have been violated and harmed and kept away from the divine. And that wounding, those violations are passed through in a cellular way through all beings on this planet. And so, Holy One, please heal us. Please open our hearts even more widely to know that we have a direct connection with you in all the forms that we pray, all the ways that we come to you. And may those who were violated in the ways that we heard tonight may their spirits be at rest and be held. And may we find hope and peace and joy and love in all the ways that you come to us. And may we be protected and held and opened by your love. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Will. I was feeling as you were speaking, I was just thinking, I mean, what you were presenting was very powerful, and to bring those truths forward, and it just was resonating with me, or I was just feeling the people who you were speaking of, the nameless, you know, who encountered all of what you're speaking of and still do.
Yeah, thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you for bringing in that prayer.
So as we move into our group time together, just to hold that in our hearts and know that we can speak from the head place of how this all is and how it's affected us, but also bring it into your heart, bring it into the cells and the all the energy of your being.
So before we go into our small groups, we wanted to show you a 4-minute film that summarizes all of this in a particular way. This film was created by one of our close colleagues, Emily Nielsen Jones, who is a good friend, and she basically runs a foundation called the Imago Dei Fund, which basically works on gender and spirituality issues. And this was an attempt by her and her colleagues to summarize essentially how they see the whole history of the oppression of the feminine. And it's only 4 minutes, and we thought we would just show it. It's just come out. This is brand new. we're showing it, not as sort of something you have to believe in, but just as a kind of an articulation of these things. And then what we'll do is we'll go into small groups and give you a chance to speak among yourselves about these various factors. So Garrett, are you ready to roll the film? Thank you.
Girl child, can you remember who you were before the world told you who you should be?
Deep down, I've always believed in myself and known I'm just as good as anyone else. But lately, I notice that the world treats me differently because I'm a girl. From sunrise to sunset, my sisters and I do chores at home, while my brothers get to do whatever they want. And I see my mother carry the full burden of tending to our family. In church, they don't like when I ask questions, so I've learned to sit quietly. In the street, I see girls who walk in fear, as mothers warn their daughters not to give men the wrong idea. Everywhere I look, the world tells me I'm inferior, but this does not feel true. What's going on here?
Girl child, you are right to question.
Who? Do I know you?
I am your mother's mother and her mother's mother. I am the mother of all.
Then you must know why the world treats us this way. Please tell me, how did this come to be?
Well, it is complicated, and there are many overlapping theories, but we do know that these traditions were man-made long, long ago. It was not always like this. In the beginning, men and women walked side by side together, valued equally as hunters and gatherers. Eventually, we began to settle down. And around this time, we elevated the idea of property and the need to own land and control a workforce. Men became protective of what was theirs, which led to fighting. Sexual violence against women became a weapon of war. Conquerors enslaved women as concubines. Men felt entitled to own and take on many wives, even in times of peace. As their wealth grew, so did the desire to give males an inheritance. Girls came to be seen as property, valued primarily for their sexual purity and ability to have children. They were exchanged between families for a price. Many girls were subjected to traditions aimed at preserving their purity and family honor. Many are still practiced today. It is this domination that gave birth to all forms of slavery and how women became the world's first slaves. It is how patriarchy and the ethic of male honor became the norm. Patriarchy was woven into our civilizations, our laws, economies, philosophies, sciences, and especially our religions. It is everywhere, and it is invisible. It's no accident that we replaced ancient images of God as both male and female with images of God as a man.
But haven't we made progress since those times?
In some ways, yes. But in many ways, we're still moving in the wrong direction.
But what can I do when patriarchy is everywhere? I can't turn my back on my family or my faith.
There is a spiritual path to liberation in the Bible and other religious traditions, but we must be brave and question what isn't working. Women and men, girls and boys, even the earth itself are suffering under the domination of patriarchy. To heal our land, we must bravely untangle our traditions from this oldest oppression. What was made by our hand can also be unmade. We must keep walking the Exodus path from slavery to the freedom of the Promised Land. Imagine if we could re-know the beautiful world that was meant for all God's children.
A world where girls can grow up feeling safe and equally valued?
A world where both boys and girls grow up to be all they were meant to be. Girl child, your curiosity has set you on a path many others have walked before you. Because of their work, we know